Move. We're going to do a PowerPoint.
Good morning, Madam Vice Mayor. How are you?
Is that Ashby Young?
Morning, Vice Mayor.
Okay, so we do have a quorum.
You made it.
Right.
What do you
We do
know?
have a quorum. There you go.
See you. Thank you for coming.
You're the lifesaver.
Yeah,
You saved
good deal.
So never mind.
Yeah, right, never mind.
Never mind.
All right. Well, with that in mind, I'd like to call the meeting to order. Welcome everybody here this morning. Thank you for being here. And I guess we'll start with a roll call, please.
Yes, sir. Mr. Barham,
Here, sir.
Mr. Bento,
Here.
Mr. Peterman, Mr. Reinerberg,
Here.
Mr. Toops, here, and Mr. Wallace. We have a quorum.
We have a quorum. Good. And on the first order of business, if we could, I'd like to approve, and I think we can do them simultaneously, can we not? The July minutes and the July joint meeting minutes, unless somebody has.
You can't do them simultaneously if you want.
Okay.
So that if everyone had a chance to look at those minutes from the July 26th meeting and also the joint meeting with the EDA that we had that kind of ran concurrently, if there's no discussion, like a motion to approve these minutes.
So moved.
Second.
All right. Mr. Barham,
Yes.
Mr. Bento,
Yes.
Mr. Reinerberg,
Yes.
Mr. Toops.
Yes.
Motion carries.
Thank you very much. And then we got to look at the financials. So do we have
No one is,
staff?
staff is not here currently for the financials.
I would suggest that we defer the financials to next month's meeting unless there's an objection to that, if we don't have staff.
I don't know where they are.
I don't
I
know.
will follow up.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so let's defer that to
Yes, sir.
next month's meeting.
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Okay, we have Mr. Sturgeon here for the under old business, our EPA update. And Mr. Sturgeon, you always give such a wonderful report, and we look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Okay. Well, thanks everyone for having me. My name's Randy Sturgeon. For those of you who don't know, I'm EPA's project manager for the Atlantic Wood Industries Superfund site, which is at the Portsmouth base of the South Norfolk Jordan Bridge. And I was told some of you are kind of new to the project and haven't heard this for the 15th time. I know some faces are very... So just real briefly, the Atlantic Wood Industries site used to make telephone poles. And so there's creosote, there was creosote out in the river, it's gone now. But creosote in the land, this was a storage area. Also in World War II, the Navy leased a lot of this back area and filled it with contaminated material and then stored war material during World War II. So there's also lead, copper, zinc. Then this 5-acre piece of property, which we're going to talk more about today, used to be the operations center for the Portsmouth Public School District. Prior to that, it was also owned by the Navy, and it was part of this whole storage area. And they gave it to the school district. I don't know, 4 or 5 years ago maybe, the school district moved off of it, and PPIC and EPA have been working together along with the state, and PPIC took ownership of it, and I'll get into more about why the work we're doing on there. But we built a wall out in the river, and so this used to be the old shoreline of the river. It was so contaminated, if you walked in the river, your leg would end up looking like a telephone pole when you got out. It would be coated with creosote. So we built this wall out here. We dredged this blue area. Half the material, a little bit less than half the material, went behind the wall and made about 6 acres of new land. And the rest of it's going in a landfill we're building back here right now. So the dredging was completed. Also, just so you know, Atlantic Wood used to own right up to Elm Avenue, and they sold some of their land to the South Norfolk Jordan Bridge Company. so that they could build a new bridge. So the bridge actually, company owns part of the Superfund site, and they did some of the work on their land. Back in 1992, Atlantic Wood stopped making telephone poles, and they were an employee-owned company and tried to figure out what can we do with ourselves instead of laying ourselves off, and started, got into the precast concrete business. So they make precast concrete. They actually did most of the precast concrete for the bridge here, but they do a lot of work and continue, have historically, and actually the size of their operation has grown in the time that I've been working on this site. Just the setting, that's the main shipyard. This is the waste incinerator, the transfer station, the Navy landfill, the Southgate Annex portion of the shipyard, PER, who's building a grain export facility, and a concrete batch plant right now is developing this piece of property here, which they purchased from PPIC as well. And then there's smaller private owned properties. And then Vane Brothers sits down here. They used to own this part, and the city owns that right now. So that's kind of the setting at the moment. So the good news is dredging's complete. We finished last fall. We dredged over 300,000 cubic yards of contaminated material. There were a few places we couldn't get all of it, like underneath some of the pilings, piers for the bridge, and some of it we found a lot deeper than we thought. We couldn't get it all right in front of our wall, but we've got the vast majority of it. We've capped the new land at the river, which I'll show you a picture of. The west landfill, which we'll talk more detail, is under construction. We've started working on the PPIC property. It's where the former school district. A number of years ago, we actually tore down the warehouses and all the school district buildings, and Atlantic Wood has been using it to store product while we were building landfill on their property. They've all but completely moved off, and we've been tearing out the foundations of the old buildings. And we're in the process of doing that right now. And the big thing is we're right now scheduled for finishing that property by mid-February of next year. This is that wall I was talking about, and that's the 6 acres of new land. It's under the bridge. So the riverbank used to be along here. And that's PER's property with, they've been doing a lot of concrete crushing and recycling, but they started to build a batch plant here, and they're going to build grain elevators in here, and that's the west landfill. That part's PPIC property, and it's about 5 acres. This is what the area under the bridge looks like. It's got a stone cap. This area, we're still working out some land ownership issues. The state is going to take ownership of this area. PER's planning on using part of this. The state may own it, and they may lease it from the state. I would encourage you that if you have interest in seeing how this gets redeveloped or have ideas, that you talk to DEQ. This was built, while it contains waste material, it was built to be usable land, and it might as well be put to use. Atlantic, this little part of the wall here, Atlantic Wood, that's where they load material onto barges when they ship out by river. But there's a lot of things about the land use, the part that's within FIGS, meets and bounds, who owns what because of where the mean low water is, and the state owning subtidal bottomlands. But the riverbank used to be way back here, so at what point do you decide, where's the line of subtidal bottomlands? There's a bunch of questions out there like that. But I know the state's DEQ and the Attorney General have been actively talking about these things. And again, as interested in redevelopment issues, I would encourage you. You're probably the folks that would bring an idea, I could easily see, to DEQ about redevelopment of some of this.
Right there. How deep the water is right there.
Who owns the property right under the bridge?
The
Right-
property right under the bridge?
Yeah.
That is within the metes and bounds of the bridge owner themselves. So everybody's property boundary goes out to the Port Warden's line, which is just outside this wall. But that brings up a bunch of land ownership issues. At one time, Mr. Dixon, who lives right here, sued the bridge for trespassing on his river bottom because he said he could trace his title back to a grant from the Crown of England. He lost that case in court because I think the judge said at some point in time the state took the land and maybe around the Revolutionary War and then gave it back to the owner. And so there was a broken chain of title. The mean low water before he built this, which ran across like this. And so that was a 1986 determination. And so if you use that as, then shoreline owners would have owned out to this area, would have owned all this, and the state would own this. The state has told me they're claiming ownership to all the new land. So those issues are,
I thought you just said the bridge owners owned it. Now
okay, there's two things. One is, if you look at the deed for the bridge, it says its property comes parallel to the bridge out to the Port Warden's line, over and back.
All right.
But that doesn't mean the bridge owns the land. That all gets into who owns the river bottom. So all these property owners, their meets and bounds, what's described on the deed, says that it goes out to the Port Warden's line, including PER, Dixon, the bridge, and Atlantic Wood. But then you get into all these issues about King's grants and subtitle bottomlands, and the fact that Atlantic, this property used to be riverfront till about probably the 1920s, and a lot of this land was filled over time. Atlantic Wood, which started operating in 1926, kept pushing material out in the river and increasing the size of their land. So you might make the case that the state actually owns what has been upland for years, but all that would never get decided except by a court of law. And anyway, but the biggest thing is I would encourage, if you're interested in this property and looking at redevelopment ideas, I would encourage you to talk to DEQ. And Robert, I can give you contact information to start if you would like.
Thank you.
Excuse me, Randy, what's the acreage on that? I don't remember.
This whole area is about just over 6 acres of new land.
Right, okay,
This sliver right here, so you can see where the old riverbank took a jog right here.
right.
If you kind of went along the shadow of the bridge, this area right here is within PER's meets and bounds. They've been talking to DEQ about using this area. They want to move their concrete crushing operation over to this land so they can continue the development of the grain operation. And then they're planning on building a bulkhead along here and putting a port facility in. And again, that's what land looks like. This is looking north toward PER. Those are piles of crushed concrete. Obviously, that's the bridge, and this is the new land that's been capped. Okay, so the west landfill, this is out of Google Earth. It doesn't quite look like this, but the general concept is we have several big piles of sediment. In fact, you can't tell from this photograph because this was during the dredging, and we hadn't placed everything over here, but we have two very large piles of sediment right here that we're going to build a landfill, comes all the way down, encompasses the PPIC property. The big problem with all this is Atlantic Wood is still producing product here. So until they move, we can't fill in, I call it the middle of the C, the middle of the U, and so it's kind of been a shell game. But now we've gotten, Atlantic Wood has moved off of this property except for a few forms are still waiting to get off, and we're actually working over here now. So Atlantic Wood's going to have a ramp to drive on, so they're going to be able to use the top of the landfill for production storage. So they have a ramp that we're building to get on top of the landfill and another one to get off the landfill. This is half the ramp going on top of the landfill, and we're building the other half right here. This gives you an idea. Then the top of the landfill will be right here, but this is all the material we've got still to put in the landfill. And this is just one stockpile. That's the one that's right here. We've got another one down here. So we're in the process of building. What this is composed of is 12 inches of of Virginia, Delaware Department of Transportation 21A stone, which when it's compacted keeps the water from going into the ground. And then we're putting another 4 inches of stone on top of it to protect it from from Atlantic Wood's use of it. This gives you an idea of how this is the western edge of the landfill where the material is going to be the highest. This is the area they're still operating in, but that gives you an idea of how deep the landfill is. But we've already started capping part of it, and we've poured two 400-foot, they almost look like roadbed of concrete, and that's so that the forming beds where they make the concrete piles here, they're going to move on top of the landfill and clear this area out. And it is a valid question where somebody might ask, well, why are you building that for them? Because it's the only way I'll get them to move. And if I don't, then we end up in a stalemate with this big pile of dirt out there. And it's a health threat leaving it out there. So just to show you, we've already started capping the landfill. We finished pouring these last week. And in 28 days, when the concrete hardens, we'll turn them over to Atlantic Wood, and they'll start moving their, not only their forming beds, they have to move utilities, there's generator, we've got to run like some overhead electrical lines back here. But once they get out of the middle of that C, we can continue our construction of our landfill. They have moved some out of the middle of the C, so they used to have stuff stored in this area. They've moved out, and we've started construction of the landfill, and so this area is slowly shrinking in size, but there's where they actually produce these piles.
The pile of dirt that is going into the landfill, is it as contaminated as, I mean, you look at it, it looks that, but I mean.
Looks like topsoil. You want to buy some?
With that, no, I mean, it does look like topsoil, so I'm just, is it as contaminated as you thought?
Yes.
Yes,
Okay.
it is.
You know, obviously, there are parts of it that aren't nearly as contaminated. In fact, the most contaminated stuff is behind the wall. The stuff with the lower levels of contamination are back here. But everything that came out of the river got mixed with cement. And so every bit of it ended up going from typical river mud that would even flow into looking like topsoil. But with the cement in it, we can compact it and actually make it stable land.
This is a permanent solution, so 20 years from now, some environmentalist doesn't complain that we got this big problem that we need to fix, correct?
Correct. We've, everybody, I think the public, local communities, EPA, would love if we could make things totally clean. And we do have sites that we clean to the point they're unrestricted use and unlimited access. In other words, you could build a daycare there, you'd have no institutional controls, no deed restrictions, stuff like that. But most of the sites I see are like this, where we have some waste left in place. We actually looked at hauling all this material off-site to an off-site landfill. The cost, or actually having to burn it, the cost was exorbitant, and which is, so you look at a bunch of different alternatives that range in cost and degree of cleanup. And the Superfund law has, and the regulations have criteria that you use about how to evaluate these different alternatives. EPA comes up with a preferred alternative. We present it to the public for comment, take those comments into account, and come up with a final decision. You know, I'm happy to talk at whatever depth about the Superfund process, but it's also very, Superfund, back in 2002, Congress amended our law with what they call the Brownfields Amendments, which allow a owner that comes in and purchases a contaminated piece of property to not be liable for the cleanup that historically was caused, or the contamination that was historically caused at the site, if they take care of the property. And so, for instance, FIG Bridge, they came in and bought 7 acres of the Superfund site. Under the law, the current owner is financially responsible. And the way it works, if you're financially responsible for $1, you're financially responsible for the whole site, the way the law is written. So Congress amended that in 2002, and they were able to come in and buy a piece of property. They came to EPA and said, you know, what are conditions you'd like us to do so we don't end up with financial liability? And EPA writes these things called comfort letters. At some sites, there's legal agreements that we sign with companies called bona fide prospective purchaser agreements. They take a lot more time. Comfort letters outlined, you know, you can't interfere with our cleanup. FIG actually did the capping of their land, and did so they incorporated some of the cleanup as part of their bridge construction. But they did that just on their 7 acres. They aren't having to clean the groundwater up under their 7 acres. So there's things like that that they're not responsible for. And so now, the thing that happens sometimes is, before we decide to clean something up, we always come to the local community and ask, what's your land use? Not only now, but what could be the land use in the future? And because that is a big factor in how clean we make a site. And we look to the local community for those kind of land use issues. We have had situations where suddenly somebody builds a housing project next to a Superfund site that 20 years ago nobody believed there'd ever be a housing project, and suddenly homeowners buy a house and then wake up one day and realize, I bought a house across the street from a Superfund site. Generally those things don't happen as much because of all the disclosure laws and stuff like that, but occasionally they happen. But it was fairly easy here to know this is always going to be industrial. It's surrounded. The Norfolk Naval Shipyard is also a Superfund site, and they've done a lot of cleanup work, but it's always going to be an industrial property. And so our goal is to clean it up, and if we can do that in a way that allows it to be used and stay in productive use, because a huge priority of EPA is reuse of land, then that's what we want to do. And we've been working with the city in various aspects for a number of years.
Thank you.
For that. At one time, this landfill was only supposed to be 3 or 4 feet high, but when we went out to do the dredging design, the extent of contamination and the depth of it was more than we had anticipated. So not only is there more material here, but it's led to the expansion of landfill to the PPIC property. So this is the PPIC property. This is the way it looked like last fall. That's all of Atlantic Wood's product stored here. This used to be warehouses, bus maintenance. It's where the plumbers and electricians were headquartered for the school district. School district and I had been talking for probably ever since the Recovery Act came out about the possibility of landfill expansion. Things didn't work out, but then this property started flooding some, and the school district warehouses, the insulation got rainwater up into the insulation, turned to mold, and they decided to move. And so there was an agreement between the city, the state, and EPA that Atlantic Wood could use it for storage so we could build a landfill on their property. We were taking up so many acreage. EPA would expand the landfill over here because we had more sediment, but that's going to raise this property above the floodplain. And the state was okay with it because the city agreed to do the O&M of this. In other words, they're going to cut the grass, they're going to monitor the groundwater, with the city's idea that this eventually turn into a private development, and the private developer will take care of that. Generally, EPA wants the polluter to pay. In this case, that's Atlantic Wood and the Navy. In situations where the polluter's not going to pay, either we can't find the polluter, they're totally broke, or they're not going to pay all of it, the federal government picks up the tab. In order for the federal government to pick up the tab, the state has to agree to pay 10% of our cleanup costs and agree to take over all the long-term operation and maintenance. And so the state was okay with the expansion of this landfill as long as it didn't cost them anything. So the city agreed to pay, I think, $200,000 to the state to cover their 10% cost share for this area, and agreed to do the operation and maintenance, and they've signed contracts with the state for that. So there's what it looked like last fall. Here's what it looks like now. Most everything's off of it, and the stuff that is still there is actually off-spec product. And as we dig up the foundations of the warehouses and crushing all that concrete, these things are going to get crushed too. So that's from pictures from yesterday. We decided we would go ahead and dig up all the foundations and crush them so that it would make it easier for somebody to develop the property. In case they need to put a sewer line in or drive piles, they're not hitting either the concrete slab of warehouse, or worse, the actual footing, where it's a lot thicker. So, and then we're using the crushed concrete to prepare the base so it's stable for the landfill to get rid of settlement problems and stuff like that.
I have a question. How are the men and women who are doing this work on this very contaminated site protected? Are they?
Yes, they are.
How?
Well, one is people who work on haz waste sites have to go through specific training according to OSHA. They call it HAZWOPER, Hazardous Waste Operations Training. And then we come up with a specific health and safety plan that talks about how you perform work at this site in a way that's safe. We monitor the air around here. We have trucks that, we have a truck that's a big water tank, so if it's a dusty day and stuff starts blowing around, we can keep everything damp. The people that are actually doing the concrete crushing, we did some soil sampling on the school district property, which is Atlantic Wood did not operate on. And the soil here is cleaner than I expected it to be. So we took some soil samples to see when we dig up this concrete, and the crushing company, what kind of safety requirements did they have to take to make sure they were prepared. The biggest safety issue out here when they crush concrete is silica dust. When you jackhammer concrete or you cut it with a saw, all that dust that comes off has silica in it, and it's messes your lungs up like asbestos. And OSHA actually, probably 6 weeks ago, increased the requirement people have for monitoring silica dust and stuff like that. So we take care of the silica dust out here. Everything else is going to get taken care of as well. Okay, so back just this area here, and once we get all the concrete crushed and the site prepared, we can actually start moving contaminated material and actually building the landfill. Couple of things. So this, remember, is our landfill. This is the design of the new landfill. It doesn't cover all of Atlantic Woods property. This is the edge of the landfill. There's a ramp that comes up. Those are those concrete forming beds that we poured. There's a ramp that goes down, and here's the PPIC property. Here's a blow-up of the PPIC property. These lines are the survey lines of the new. This is going to be the lowest area. The rainwater is going to drain to this area. This area is being built high enough to get it out of the floodplain, and then we have to go up from there so we can actually move water, and then it's a little steeper right along the roadbed. The city engineering department came out the beginning of this month. We mentioned to them if there are any issues with how they wanted like an entrance to this property built. Now's the time to tell us before we start building it. So they came out and looked at a few things. They haven't provided any feedback to us. But somebody will be able to, come off of Burton's Point Road. Now, the other thing, are you guys familiar with the fact that they're upgrading Burton's Point Road? Burton's Point Road, let me go back just a second. So this is Burton's Point Road where you drive down. It's actually built on railroad property. There's a 60-foot wide easement or right-of-way for the railroad. The city owns 60 feet over here, and they're planning on moving Burton's Point Road over to their own property. Last time I met with the city, James Wright told me they actually had funding for that.
We do.
That could happen next year.
They're working.
Part of that involves probably adding about on average 2.5 feet to the city right-of-way, and it'll raise the roadway up out. One of the things that'll happen is Atlantic Wood historically has had an easement to cross the railroad property, but instead of driving everywhere with their gantry cranes, they're only going to be able to cross the road and the railroad right here. So one of the things that I would suggest is you guys look into, do we need to do anything in order to cross railroad property to get to the street? Because right now, those issues nobody's really worried about because there's the roadway. There's no train tracks open train tracks right there, but the railroad is keeping the property in case there's a need at some point. They can run rail back into here again. And
Is that the rail that goes to the PER property, or is that rail on the other
no,
side?
that's up here.
Okay.
This rail historically had spurs into Atlantic Wood on both sides of the property and could come down here to Southgate Annex if it wanted to. I'm not quite sure how the railroad property looks right. I know the city's right. I think they both go straight down. And down here, though, that's private property right in here. I've met with Donna Coleman, who works at the railroad. She told me there is, government money that would help her open a railroad if there was ever a need that arose. So I just share that with you because that, could change how some of this property gets used. So a couple things that I wanted to ask about today. So there's drainage pipes in the ground here where the school district property would drain into manhole storm drains along here. And so we ran, a couple of things we found is, well, the other thing you should know is immediately south, that was an oil terminal, Sinclair and British Petroleum. It had oil leaks. There is, I'll talk about some oil that we found on the PPIC property. There is some contaminated groundwater migrating into the storm sewer. It's oil related. We've done some sampling of it. There's not a whole lot. We're not addressing that. We did a videotape of the storm sewer to see is it in viable condition so they can drain the landfill, and there's no collapsed areas. Water's moving freely back and forth into the 72-inch storm drain over here. The likelihood that all this water can drain into the actual storm sewer during a heavy rain it's not big enough. It's only an 18-inch size pipe, somewhere 21 inches. When this property was sold to the Navy, the city retained an overland drainage easement down to Paradise Creek, which will also, and I'm sure some of this property is always drained overland down to Paradise Creek. The Navy has some type of valve box down here that we've talked to them about. If they would take out a little concrete structure or control the vegetation in here, things would drain better back here. But we haven't, and we've talked to them about that, but nothing's happened.
So is there a decision to be made by somebody?
I think that I could see after we build this, I would say it's probably in the city's best interest that if they had discussions about making sure this drains more freely with the Navy. There's a swale in between two Navy landfills. And I don't know, they must have had some pipes running back and forth between the landfills at one time. It doesn't have to be done, but this property here is also about 5 acres, and about 25 to 30% of it is wetlands. It wasn't historically wetland. And I have a feeling the reason it's wetlands is because it doesn't drain well anymore to Paradise Creek.
So do I understand that existing storm sewer at the south side of the property is not sufficient enough to drain the property when it's completed? Is that right?
Well, it will.
In a heavy rain?
In a heavy rain.
So, okay.
Well, plus the fact is, at high tide, nothing. At high tide, you have water backing up.
In the existing?
In the existing, right.
So when this is completed, and we have the raised, 4-foot raised property, your assessment is that it's still in a heavy rain will not drain sufficiently?
No, but it won't be wet up here. Because this is going to be elevated, and the water's all going to go down to a lower area. Whereas before, with the school district, it had no place to go. But that's why we've looked at the floodplain and maps. We're raising this above that.
Kind of like kicking the can. As areas are raised, it now floods in a new place when the water doesn't have anywhere to go. And I mean, cooperatively could fix it potentially, but when this is raised, it'll pool at the base of it.
Well,
unless it works with the Navy.
Because we're dealing with tide, it's not going to. Like at high tide, water coming back is going to keep coming back. Now there's going to be less water coming back because it can't fill up this area with water. It might be in the city's best interest to put a tide gate right here so that at least water can't back up into the property. But this, I know right now, the intersection of Victory and Elm Avenue, you have to be careful at high tide and a big rain when it's like, am I going to make it through this to the stoplight? And then when the tide goes out, it drains. So even if we made this pipe 6 feet in diameter, it's not going to drain at high tide in a big rain. Because the drainage is controlled by the elevation of Paradise Creek. Okay, so some of the cap, we kind of have 2 caps at Atlantic Wood. We have stone cap and grass cap. And the stone cap makes a nice working surface. But what I've realized over the past few months, and what I wanted to ask you is, do you want a stone cap or a grass cap? A grass cap would have 12 inches of clay to keep rainwater from percolating into the contaminated material, 6 inches of topsoil, and then vegetation. What we're finding is weeds want to grow in stone as good as any other place, and you can't have the weeds growing through the 12 inches of compacted stone, because then you create drainage pathways through the stone. So so it kind of depends on how much maintenance you want to do to the property. If we do vegetation, you mow it once a year, or you mow half of it once a year and the other half in another year. Somebody can build on top of it either way. Obviously, it's probably easier for somebody to envision what goes on if it's a stone cap, but it's cheaper to build a stone cap, just harder to take care of. But I didn't know whether you guys envisioned. To me, one of the ways you might think about that is how soon do we picture somebody actually building on that versus how long might we have to take care of it before we're able to develop it. And you don't have to tell me today, but I did need to know very quickly.
Question about that. How long would the property need to sit to where we had good compaction? I know it depends on what project's going on there, but you know.
We're compacting it. It's being laid out in lifts and rolled and compacted.
Okay.
We couldn't do that behind the wall because of the condition of the material when we placed it there as well. But this is being laid out in 12-inch lifts and compacted along the way. So it's will be very stable.
So,
you can use it day one.
Yeah, okay. That's where I was going, because then that kind of changes our thinking a little bit on what we need to do. Okay.
In the process of digging up these foundations, this was a bus garage. We found some oil in the ground. This was just Friday. We kind of dug a 12 by 12 foot area and we stopped. We're coming out with a piece of equipment that pokes holes in the ground so we can determine how big this is. It's not related to the Superfund site. We're not addressing it in all likelihood, unless it becomes a foundation problem. And the groundwater is so high out there that sometimes when we take these slabs off, it's like mush. And so we're taking this crushed concrete and packing it back in to the material. But I just share that there are some environmental issues. I know the school district had some leaking underground storage tanks at one time. There's groundwater coming over from the Navy landfill. There is some area up here that's contaminated from Atlantic Wood. There was an oil storage tank, and the Navy used to operate this as well. So, and that's partly why even putting contaminated material on here is not making it any worse than it already is. But you'll be able, none of this will prevent any development. We'll end up providing you with maps of everything we leave behind in the ground, anything we find, so that a developer, when they know where they want to run a utility, for instance, has as much information, has all the information that we've learned over time in order to do that. The other thing that was a little bit of a surprise to us is when we did some of this work, we did some work over here for the Superfund site while the school district was operating. And we had to move their electrical utilities, and the school district told us we have three-phase power. And so when we moved some of their poles and stuff and changed out some of their equipment, we did it all for certain three-phase power. Well, so we were just going to tap into that for Atlantic Wood to run their forming beds, only to find out it's not three-phase power back there. There's two legs, two conduits that run underground back here off of a Dominion power pole. And to get three-phase power, which Atlantic Wood needs, we'd have to run a third conduit underground here. And we chose to run an overhead line along the property boundary because of cost. Coupled with, when we talked to the city, they weren't so keen on having those underground electrical conduits there. But when somebody goes to develop it, they'll have to figure out what their power needs, where they want to come in. Nothing, I mean, they probably could put a third conduit under here, but you know, if they need power in the middle here, running it straight from the street, as opposed to running something all the way back here just to run it out to the middle. But those are electrical issues, you know, developers gonna have to work out. And so to me, I think the big things to keep in mind are stone versus grass. Keep in mind the electrical, and then what kind of road entrance and how this upgrade to Burton's Point Road affects this, because I've seen the plans for Burton's Point Road, and we've talked with the developer for the past, the designer for the past several years, trying to coordinate our work at Atlantic Wood with where the elevations of the road were going to be. But as far as the entrance here, there really hasn't been a topic of discussion with the planner, and I can't remember. I think the right in here, I think, is about where the end of the street reconstruction is going to happen. And so there's this crossover area about how to get onto this property that I would encourage you to look into that quickly. One of the things that I kind of see is, because of our work out there, it's kind of highlighted what I kind of think of as no man's land, where you sometimes have cars have driven underneath the gantry crane as it goes down the roadway on the railroad's property, that now all this work is highlighting who owns what, and you know, Atlantic Wood's not going to be able to drive up and down the road anymore. They're only going to be able to cross in certain spaces, but it's the Navy's having to move some of its infrastructure because they built it on city property. But it's highlighting all those issues and making people to do things more a formal way that probably should have been done that way all along. But any questions?
Randy, the notice that went out a couple months ago, could you just talk about that real briefly and the timing on everything?
Okay, so in order to expand the landfill, that's a modification to our cleanup. It's a kind of modification, so the document that outlines how we clean it up, the legal document is called a record of decision. It can be modified. This kind of modification requires what they call an explanation of significant differences. We released a draft of that at the end of June for public comment. The only comments we got back were a letter of support from the PPIC, and then the Navy had a few technical comments that really didn't affect our thinking about that. That comment period closed the end of July. We are awaiting a concurrence letter from DEQ saying we support this. And then, and once we get that, well, so then back in April, the other thing that happened in April, the end of April, is former Administrator Pruitt said that at any site that's over $50 million cleanup, and this one's over $100 million, that adds another dollar in cost to the cleanup, he wants to make the decision about. So we had to brief the administrator's office before we released the ESD for public comment, and we did. And front office, the administrator's office was fine with us releasing it. Obviously, Administrator Pruitt is now former, and Acting Administrator Wheeler still wants to sign that. And so we've been working, as soon as that comes in, the letter from the state, the documents all ready to head up to the EPA's front office in DC, and I expect it to be signed quickly. There's huge issues. Obviously, I'm starting to build a landfill. I'd rather have that document signed than not. And it also contains some other things about building those forming beds and that type of thing, which have a lot to do with some legal negotiations going on between the state, Atlantic Wood, and the Navy, which are going to help provide money for us to pay for the rest of the cleanup. And a lot of that hinges on getting that document signed. So I expect that letter to show up any day from the state. And if it doesn't, I might call you and say, can you call the state? Anything else?
So, just real quick, Mr. Sturgeon, all said and done, everything stay on pace, we stay on track. How long are we talking?
Well, right now, the most up-to-date schedule I got yesterday was to finish this in February of 19, mid-February of 19. In order, obviously, we don't have control of our site that we're building on. And so, and we don't always get control of it when we want. So we've tried to do schedule our work with a lot of flexibility. So what we think we're going to work on next week may not be, depending on when it took a while for Atlantic Wood to get off of here. They've given up some of this land, so suddenly we can start building part of the landfill in here that we weren't expecting. But we have, the nice thing is now we actually have control of this property, so we can work on it. Probably the biggest thing is it's been very wet this summer, and that has hindered us more than anything. Is the rain.
Yeah.
Because we keep, once this stuff gets wet, we can't compact it. So we got to wait a day or two. And
Thank you.
All right.
but if anybody wants to come see it, please let me know. If you actually want to walk, like I say, this part of the landfill is actually capped. We can take you up on there to look. We can take you in through this. Just let me know. We've got people on site that could show you that whenever you want to.
All right.
Mr. Sturgeon, thank you so much. Your presentations are always great, very enlightening.
thank you.
And we appreciate, catching up, because you guys have done an awful lot of work over time. And, I do drive-bys on that property every once in a while, but it's nice to hear exactly what's happening. So thank you so much for being here. We appreciate it very much.
You're welcome. So if there's nothing else.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Robert,
Yes, sir.
I'm just going to leave this, it's on the desktop of here, and that way you can
Okay.
have it for your records.
Thank you.
Okay, so Mr. Moore, would you like to make your appointment?
Yes, sir. Thank you, Chair. Wanted to take a moment, I think when we had the joint meeting and the, kind of combined meetings last month, I believe I introduced staff, but I would like to do that again. I am happy to report that economic development staff has grown. We certainly have Miss Ashley Henley, who is our business retention manager. We have Mr. Armand Smith, who is our business attraction manager. And we also have Mr. Brian Donahue, who is our new assistant director. Mr. Donahue comes to us after about 9 years in the city of Portsmouth at the Portsmouth Redevelopment and Housing Authority. Mr. Donahue and I personally go back some years to our years as planners together in the city of Suffolk. So he coming onto the team is a great asset. He also has about 20 years of just development and redevelopment experience. But that being said, I wanted to do two things. One, introduce him and give him an opportunity to speak. And then at the same time, we would like to go with the appointment of him as the Assistant Secretary to the PPIC. But I'll lend to Mr. Donahue.
Thank you for the introduction, Mr. Moore. Good morning. It's a pleasure to be here with the board, working with the commissioners and city staff. So I look forward to working with you and assisting in the city's efforts and development. Thank you.
Well, we don't have to welcome you to Portsmouth, obviously, but welcome to PPIC. So we're glad you're here as well. Thank you very much. So with that, we need a motion to appoint him to the Assistant Secretary from PPIC. So moving. Second?
I'll second.
Second.
All right. Mr. Barron?
Yes.
Mr. Bento?
Yes.
Mr. Peterman?
Yes.
Mr. Reinerberg?
Yes.
Mr. Toops?
Yes.
Motion carries.
Welcome aboard. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, and then I guess you...
And then the
Talk
last
about the
thing,
retreat.
yes, sir. Last thing, Mr. Chair, is you should have received, and if not, you have in front of you a letter from the mayor, and we certainly have the vice mayor here this morning. But on September the 8th, which is a Saturday, from 9 to 3, we are having a boards and commissions retreat. So all of the boards and commissions of the city of Portsmouth are meeting and having a retreat with city council. I will be one of the presenters to talk about our strategic plan and economic development. But it's a little bit different from what we've talked about before. Certainly, I've come before the board and presented the strategic plan and talked about what we are going to do. That particular event, we will be talking about not only what we are going to do, but how we are going to do it as a staff with this new staff. So we invite all of you all certainly to come out. If we could have a head count to Miss Ogilvy by the end of this week, just so we know who will be attending, and we can let Miss White know as well in the mayor's office.
Okay. Thank you very much. Appreciate that. I'd like, before we adjourn, if we could, does anybody have any comments about anything that's on their mind for this board? I have one, but I'd like anyone else.
Can I just ask a question on, the decisions that he asked to be made, were stone cap, grass cap. Who's flipping that nickel? Is that somebody, are you doing that?
That's engineering. Engineering works very closely with this entire project, and our chief engineer is James Wright, who has come before this commission and made several presentations. So in conjunction with our engineering team and with Mr. Sturgeon's, at the appropriate time, that decision will be made.
Same thing with the access to the property.
Yes, and the road which he speaks of, the team has been working since I arrived in 2015. It is in the CIP budget, so that project is going forward.
Okay.
I would like to suggest, just along those lines, I'm sure this has been thought of, but once this property is done, while we're waiting for it to be sold, while it's being marketed, I'm sure it could be used by the city for storage if there was any such a need. So that's why I was thinking maybe the crush and run cap on it would at least make it usable rather than an open pasture land, just waiting for it to be sold.
Yeah, I thought the same thing, or at least half of it. the crush and run. It also
Right.
shows well if some, prospective buyer is going to
It
come out to
does.
have an entrance ramp with at least
Yeah.
half stone. Just my suggestion.
Yeah, I was
as
gonna
well.
say, the photos of that area under the Jordan Bridge right now, that looks pretty
attractive.
spiffy. Yeah, so,
And like you said, usable, so.
yeah.
Okay, my only comment today was that, kind of a segue to this, is I'd like to see if we could get in touch with Jim Solomon or one of those. I think a PER property update and progress right now, his point of view from what's going on would be really good for the commission to hear. It kind of completes that piece of property, and see what his intentions are to maybe take over that little half-acre piece that they were talking. Just all of those things would kind of define this piece a little better, so.
Yes, sir. We will
We could
work
get-
to have that for September.
Other than that,
And you were talking about the piece that's right kind of at the bridge that they've done, that the state has taken over, but probably not as long-term, to show our
that
interest.
sliver of, yeah, and then.
Show
a
our
tiny little
interest
piece
in
in
it.
the bottom.
Yeah.
And as our city manager said, the city obviously will be
Yeah.
working on those
Yeah.
things. Those are huge legal issues, and they take a long time. I remember from this piece over here, so. But if there's nothing further, thank everybody for being here, Vice Mayor, City Manager, and staff. We appreciate it. Welcome aboard. Meeting's adjourned. Thank you.